Budget tracking should not be a full-time job. In this video, you will learn how to set up a fully automated budget system in Power BI. Here is the scenario. You are the financial controller of the Panda Bamboo company, and each quarter you collect budget sheets from the project managers. Then you need to consolidate that data into a single data set, and you need to prepare a report for the management. You also need to be aware of the overall trends and individual changes of particular projects. Currently, you're using Excel to bring all that data together and to prepare that report, but it's a very painstaking and time-consuming process. So surely there must be a smarter way of doing things. And there is. In this video, you will learn how you can use SharePoint and Power BI to set up a fully automated budget reporting system. These are all the topics that we're going to cover in this video. First of all, we're going to take a look at how to set up the SharePoint structure and set up the permissions to manage your budget sheets. Then we're going to take a look at how you can use the SharePoint connector within Power BI to dynamically import all those budget sheets. Because each period we're going to get a new set of documents, and we don't want to continuously maintain and update our data import. We want to make sure that it can run on autopilot. Then we're going to take a look at how you can import Excel sheets with a dynamic structure. So I created a very simplified version of a budget, but we have a breakdown of the costs, and the actual breakdown, so the line items making up that cost, is different from one project to another. So how can we work with Excel files where the structure is not always the same from one project to another, but we still want to make sure that it can be imported automatically. And then lastly, we want to visualize our data. And something that I'm very interested in as a financial controller is to see how my assumptions have changed over time. So I have projects that run over multiple quarters, and each time I get an updated budget. But what are the changes in my initial assumptions? For example, have my costs changed? Or is there maybe an update in the price that I can charge to my customer? I want to see a little bit what is the evolution of the assumptions that I'm taking in my different projects over time. The first thing that we need to do is set up our SharePoint environment. We need to create a landing area where our project managers can drop their budget sheets and we can pick them up with our Power BI report. I already created a SharePoint site. You can do it either directly within SharePoint, or if you create a new team within Teams, then it will also automatically spin up a SharePoint site. And then within the Documents section, I have added a folder, our project's budgets folder. And then within that folder, I have subfolders containing a folder for each quarter, so for each reporting period. And the first thing that we're going to do is, once we have set up a new SharePoint site, is making sure that our security settings are in place, so that only the people who are allowed to make changes are able to do so. And then I will also show you what is a best practice to manage those budgets. So first of all, on the top level, I have my project's budget folder. If I then go to the more options and select Manage Access, then you can see there are no security settings on an individual level, but by default there are some groups, some predefined groups within a SharePoint site that already have some access settings. And there are three standard groups within a SharePoint site. You have the owners, you have the visitors, and you have the members. The visitors here I'm going to take out, so they currently have a view setting. I just want to make sure that only people that I have specifically selected can see those documents. So that visitors credential I'm going to take out. So select visitors, go to the more options, and then here we're going to select remove direct access, remove, and then we are just left with the owners of the group and the members. And then the distinction between the owners and the members here, what I'm going to make is that for the owners of that site, those will be the ones making our consolidated financial report. So those will be the owners, the ones that are going to manage the Power BI report as well. And then my project managers, I'm going to put in the members group. So those can here also edit those credentials, but on a subfolder level, I'm going to make some couple of changes. So here that's fine. So both the owners and the members can edit. Then we'll go a level deeper. And then what I'm gonna do is for each reporting period, I create a new subfolder. So here I have already collected data for the first 3 quarters. And then what we can do is to say, like, when a reporting period is open, I'm gonna allow my project managers to make changes to those budget sheets and also to make sure that they can upload new documents. So let's say that we are now in a new quarter. So what we can do is then we're gonna create a new folder, so 2024, and then a Q4 folder. And then it will inherit the permissions of the parent folder. And if you remember, we have edit permissions for both the owners of the SharePoint site and the members. So if I then expand it and go to manage access, then you will see it has inherited the permissions of those 3 groups. And then when I have a new reporting period open, then for me it's fine that everybody can make changes to it. But I also want to make sure that whenever we have closed a reporting period, when everybody has uploaded that data, that they cannot make changes afterwards. So once we have collected that data and it's part of our report, I want to make sure that I close that period and that my project managers cannot make additional changes after the fact. So I have those 3 subfolders here from Q1 to Q3, and I'm going to edit the permissions of those folders so that only the owners can still make changes to those reports, but that my project managers can only consult those documents. So they cannot make changes to the underlying documents anymore. So let's select the first one and go to manage access. And then we go to groups here, and then my SharePoint members, they currently have edit access. And then this we're going to change to view, so they can open those documents, they can download it if they want, so they can see whatever they have added, but they cannot make changes to those documents. So we're going to make it a bit more a granular permission. We're going to do the same for the other folders as well. Now my last folder. So now I've made sure that in my new reporting period, my project managers can still upload documents and make changes as long as I allow them to. But then in my closed periods, those documents can be read by our Power BI report in the next step, but they cannot make changes to that underlying data anymore. Now we have set up the basic structure for our SharePoint site and set the appropriate permissions so it can serve as a data landing area. Now we're going to import all that data in our Power BI report. And then we're also going to take a look at the structure of those budget sheets, because that structure can be a little bit tricky from time to time. So let's dive into it. Let's take a look at the structure of our budget sheets. So for each period, I have a collection of budget sheets. So here I have 2 different ones. I have Project Bamboo Express and Project Bamboo Logistics. If I open a project sheet, then you can see I have a cost segment, a revenue segment, and then my margin. And then underneath the costs, there is a breakdown of the costs. If I look at a different project sheet, that structure is pretty similar. So here I have a breakdown of the costs, but what you will notice is that the number of lines and also the labels of the lines can be different from one project to another. Our challenge exists in that we need to find a way to dynamically extract those details. What we will do in Power BI is use a technique where we will use some kind of a marker, some kind of a fixed element within our report that we know upfront that will exist, and use that as a guide to dynamically extract that information. Here, for example, I could start from my costs line. So that is a title that I know that will always exist in every budget sheet. And then I could stop at the total cost line. So those are elements that are fixed in every report, but what is in between, that is something that is variable. But if we know what is the position of my cost line and what is the position of the total cost record, then I can use Power BI and give it instructions to get everything in between those 2 elements. So let's go to Power BI and see how that works in practice. We're going to create a new Power BI report, and then we're going to import that data from SharePoint. So we're going to go to Get Data, to More, and then we need to select the SharePoint folder connector. Now we need to enter our site URL. Let's go back to our SharePoint site, and then it's the name of your tenant, then /site, and then the name of your site. Let's copy that URL to our SharePoint folder connector. Click OK. Now it's asking us how we're going to authenticate. Let's pick our Microsoft account and sign in. Sign in with my current user, and then we'll click on connect. Then we are presented with an overview of all the files that are in our SharePoint site. And as a best practice, I would also say like create a different SharePoint site for each type of project. So if you want to do a data import project like we're doing now, don't mix it up with any other stuff, because it's first going to start by listing all the files in there. So you have 1,000 other irrelevant files. This list is going to become very, very big. And we can filter it out in the next step, but it's way more efficient that you just have a clean site that is just going to contain the files that you need for this specific analysis. Then we're going to click on the arrow down and not simply click on combine, because then it's going to combine and load that data, but we're going to click here on combine and transform data. So we're going to do some data transformations first. Now we need to select which data that we're gonna import, and by default it's just gonna pick the first file. If we want to have a specific file, we can also go here, and that's also a reason why it's a best practice just to have a separate site that is just gonna contain the files that you need for your import project here, and not mix it up with anything else, because otherwise this list will be very long, and that can also create some errors, especially if you pick a first file and that file is not relevant, then it's gonna break in the next step. So we're just gonna either say first file, or you could select a specific one. Here we have like standard budget templates, so we can keep it on the first file, and then what we're gonna import here is the sheet one. Now we are in Power Query. Our SharePoint connector went through all the files on our SharePoint site and has then combined all that data. And what is important here is if you go to the source, then it starts just by listing all the files, and then it's going to process all the files one by one, applying a certain logic. So that's a logic that we're going to rework in a moment. But we need to make sure that all those files are in the same type of layout. And what I also do as an additional safety is to place a filter that it will only take the files that are in that specific folder. If at some point somebody adds something outside of that folder, then it would discard those files. So what I can do here is if I go to my paths, so you can see here I have the different subfolders there. So what I can do is just to say like everything within my shared documents project budgets folder, that is something that I am willing to take into account, and everything else I'm gonna leave out. I'm just gonna right click and copy the folder path, and then here in my filter, my text filters, I'm gonna say begins with, and then insert a step. And then I'll paste the value that I just copied and remove the last part, so that everything that is where the folder name starts with my tenant name and then the project budgets folder, that is something that I'm going to retain. So in this case, it will not make any difference to the amount of files that are listed, because they are all within that same parent folder. But if now I add something outside of it, then it will be filtered out here in the next step. So that's just an additional safety, an additional safeguard, because if you don't do it and somebody adds an additional file that is not in that budget structure, then it would break the import. Here on the right, you can see all the steps that it's going through. So first it's selecting all the files, then filtering it based on my folder. And then you can see here, there is an invoke custom function 1. So that's a step that has been created automatically. And what it's gonna do is for each of the files that I have listed here, it's gonna apply a certain transformation logic. So that's included here. I have my transform sample file. If I click here on that file, then I can see here what it's gonna do with that particular file. So this is my sample file. So here you can see the steps that have been added by default by Power BI. It's going to go to the source, navigate to my sheet 1. It has captured all the data in my first sheet, and then it has promoted the headers. The promotion of the headers, it's not something that I need because those are not my column names. So let's remove the promotion of the headers. And what I want to do in the next step is just to get everything that is a breakdown of the cost. So here I have a title row, line 5, containing the costs, and then I have material and labor, which is a breakdown, and then I have a line just the total of those cost elements added together. And what I want to have in this import is just this part. So I just want to have the breakdown of those costs, and that's something that we then can work with. And it's important that we apply all the different transformation steps here, because if we start to clean up our file there, then it's just going to do it on the aggregate. So we're going to make sure that we're first going to clean up the data import for each individual file, and then we're going to merge all those clean files together. And the way to just capture those two lines, we could, for example, say I'm just going to place a filter, and then based on the title, the type of cost here, I would place a filter on all those cost elements, and I would get those lines. But the tricky part is I don't know what those lines will be. So here is just material and labor, but in another project they can be named differently. So I cannot simply place a filter based on the name in a particular cell. What we're gonna do is we're gonna place an index column, and then we're gonna define what is the line of our cost. So the title record here with costs, and then also what is the line of the total cost. So if I can find that this is record 5 and this is record 8, then I can say give me all the lines that are just in between, so lines 6 and 7. So we're going to add an index column. Let's go here to add column, and then say add index column from 0. And now I have an index column here. And now that I have my index column, I want to find on which index item my costs line is located. I'm gonna right click my steps here and say insert step after. I have a custom step that has been added. I find it a little bit easier to work in the advanced editor, so just go here. Now I have my custom step here. I'm gonna rename it to find costs title position. So I renamed my step to find costs title position, and what I'm doing here is I'm gonna say like within that table, within that first column, let's look what the position is for costs. And then I'm also gonna return that value just to see what it's gonna look like. I'm gonna say done. And then it has returned a single value 4. Now we need to do the same also for our total costs. Let's go back to our advanced editor. I'm just gonna copy these records and then find total cost title position, and then the value that I'm gonna look for here is total costs. Let's return that value and see if we get the correct result. So that's correct, 7. So what it's gonna say is here, the first one, so the find cost title position is returning value 4, and then my second one is returning value 7. So that's exactly what I want to have. And now that I have the two positions, I just want to get the two lines in between. Let's go back to our advanced editor. I'm gonna add a new step in there. I'm gonna create a costs table. And what I'm gonna say is I'm gonna return a table range from my added index step. So here I have added an index to that column, and then I'm gonna say start from the position of my cost title plus 1, so the record after it, until, and then I need to say how many records do I want to have. So it's the position of my total in there, my cost total, minus where I started, minus 1. So that's going to return all the lines in between. And then I'm going to return that cost table. done. Let's see if we get the expected output. So that's fine. Now I get my two cost elements. I still have my index column. That's something that I'm gonna remove. And I'm also gonna rename the columns. So this is my cost item. I'm gonna call it. These are my actuals to date, until the date of that budget. My budget costs, budget to completion. And then this is my total. So that's gonna be my actuals until the moment I create that budget, still plus everything that is still expected to come. So now I have a clean table. I'm still gonna change my data types. I'm gonna make sure that this is a text value, and then these are all decimal values. Now that our data transformation for an individual file is in order, so I have a clean table of my cost elements, we need to revert back to our consolidating query. So you can see here, if I go back to query 1, there is this triangle and it's also throwing an error because when we started, it has automatically added some data transformation steps here in the consolidation part. But in the meantime, we have made some changes to our individual files. So that's why right now here in the middle, it's gonna invoke that custom function 1, which is actually that transformation of the individual file. But because we've changed it, the steps that come behind it, they are now a bit corrupt. So that is something that we need to fix. So I'm just gonna start from here and we're gonna see from the source, and then we'll work our way down to see where it is actually breaking. You can see it's still working. It's invoking custom function 1, which is our individual file. And then it's gonna go to renaming of the columns. So far, everything is still working. I can see here has applied that transformation step. And what you will see here, the transformation file, that's actually a table. And then in the next step, we can break it down to see the individual columns. So let's go a little bit further and see what it has done. Renamed some columns, removed some other columns here as well. Okay, so far everything is good. So you can see all my files that have been imported, and then here that last column, that's actually the result of that individual file transformation. And you can see it has a data type of table. So the breakdown of the actual columns that's here in that table. I will follow it a little bit further. Here it's still working, it's expanded, and then change my type, and there it's breaking. So I'm gonna remove the change type. That's still working, but what I saw here is that I went from this column, from this table, and then it has removed some other columns. And while that is working, the problem here is that I can see all my different projects and then the associated breakdown of the costs, but I cannot see for which of the periods that breakdown actually is. So that's something that we need to bring in. I cannot see what is my Q1, Q2 breakdown that has been lost here because I have this automatic step of removing the other columns. I'm gonna take out the expansion and then also the removal of the other columns. And then I'm gonna start from this step. And to get the actual period of a particular budget, we can go here. And you can see here I have my folder path. And in my folder path, we had a naming convention of using the year and then the quarter. If we capture this part, so the period part, then we can use it as a data point in our table. So let's start by extracting first the period from the folder path. We'll go to add column and then a custom column. Then we need to write our code. What I'm going to do here is, first of all, I'm going to remove the trailing / from that folder path. And then I'm going to take the part after the last / that is remaining within that URL. I'll name my column name to period. And then you can see now I have my clean period column here. Now that I have my clean period column, I also want to do a transformation with my source name column. So I just want to extract the project name. So remove the project and a space, and then also remove the file extension. So here again, having a clear naming convention will allow us to extract that data point. We're going to add a new column called project name. What I'm going to do is get everything before my file extension, and then I'm also going to remove project space at the beginning. And now we get a clean project name column. Okay, now it's time to remove some of the columns that I don't need anymore. I want to keep my project name, also the period, and then this column as well, so the transformation file, which is going to contain the actual breakdown of our costs using that transformation step that we have created earlier. So let's select the columns that I want to keep, right click, and then say remove other columns. Now I have my project name and my period, and now it's time to do the breakdown again of those costs. So let's click on the expand icon. I get the option to keep the original column name as a prefix. That's something I'm not going to use because otherwise it will always be transform file.cost item, transform file.actuals. I just want to have the clean column names in there. Let's untick it, and then we'll click on OK. And now it has expanded our columns, and I have now a clean table with the detail of my project name, my period, and then the different columns that I got from my transformation step. Now let's tidy up some elements, so make sure that our data types are correct. First three ones are of a text data type, and then the three last ones are decimals. Now our data types are in order. It's time to do a little bit of tidying up. So rather than just having query 1, I'm going to call this my costs. And now it's time to import our data. Now I have my costs imported. So let's start to visualize them. Let's take my project name. Then I also have my total costs, which is my actuals and the budget to completion. Let's just take the total here. Of course, here it's gonna sum everything up over the different periods, which is not correct, but I just want to, for a start, just to visualize how my total cost is evolving over the different periods. We can either use a matrix or we can use something like a line visual or a bar chart. So let's go for a line here. And then I'm gonna use my period as my x-axis, and then my project name will be the legend. And then I can see a little bit what was the evolution of my total costs over time. But of course, the sorting is not yet correct. It's sorting based on my total value. Let's go back to my sorting here, and then I'm gonna sort based on my period. And then also make sure that I'm sorting ascending so I can see the correct evolution. And then I can see the evolution of my costs over time. This part is working. But of course, now we have already imported the cost component. We also want to bring in the revenue part. And here my revenue is just a single line, so that's a little bit easier than the breakdown of the costs. If, for example, you also have multiple lines, you can follow the same logic. But here I'm just gonna import a single line. So let's go back to our Power BI report. Go to Get Data again, More, and then again, we're gonna choose for the SharePoint folder connector. Enter my site URL, and then here expand down and pick combine and transform data. We want to be in full control of our data transformations. And like before, it has created a new query here, query 1, which is consolidating RL files, and it has also created a transformation step. But let's maybe tidy up things a little bit here, because it's gonna be hard to remember which transformation is doing what. So I had my first one here. I forgot to rename it in the previous step. So this one is actually doing the transformation for my costs. So let's rename this group, transform file, and then we'll call it costs, collapse it. And then I also have my transform file here for my revenue. And then as a reminder, first we're gonna start again with the transformation steps of an individual file. And once we are fine with result of a single file, then we're going to rework our consolidated part. So we're going to go to the transformation sample file 2 here. I see it has again promoted those headers that I'm going to remove. That's not something that I need. I'm fine here with the starting point. I have my source and I navigate to my first sheet. And then here I just want to get a single line, which is actually named contract price. So let's just select contract price here. If you would have had a breakdown of different income elements, then you should follow the logic like we did before, where you are finding an anchor point, a start and an end, and then extract all the lines in between. But here, just a single line. Then we need to rename our columns. So the first column I'm going to call a revenue item. Then I have my actuals. These are my actuals. Then I had my budget to completion. And then I had a total column as well. Let's fix the data types, text, and then all the other columns are decimals. The structure of our individual file is now in order. Let's go back to our consolidating query and then work our way up. So change data type. I'm going to remove here as well the expansion and the removal of the other columns I'm going to take out. And I'm going to start from this part. So here I need to do the same as I did before by adding a custom column to get the period from the folder path and then also to get the project name from the source name. So let's apply the same steps as we did before. Add a custom column for the project name. And then we also add a custom column for the period. So then select all the columns that you want to retain. So that's our period, project name, and then also the breakdown of our revenue. Select those columns and then pick remove other columns. Now we need to expand it. Untick use original column names as a prefix. Okay. Now I have my breakdown and that's looking fine. Let's rename this one to revenue. So now I have both my costs element and my revenue. And let's click close and apply to load in all that data. Now we have both our cost and revenue data imported. And I want to show them side by side. So here I have my costs that have been added. Now I also want to see my revenue. So if I take my total revenue and add this one to the same chart, then you can see it will throw me an error because there is no relationship between those fields. And the problem is, if I look at my data model here, I now have two tables. So they start both from the same budget sheets, but I have not really defined a relationship between them. So I cannot tie both my costs and my revenue together. So that is something that we need to fix. And how can we make that link together? One, we have here our project name. So that's something where we can say, okay, this is tying the projects together, but we need to be a bit more granular. We also have our period here. So the unique combination is here having period and project name. And to do that, we need to go back to our transformation step and then create an artificial column that is going to be the key to link those two tables together. Let's go to transform data. And then here in my cost table, we're going to add a new custom column. Call it key. I have my key column, which is a concatenation of the period and the project name. I'm going to do the same for my revenue table. A column, custom column. Concatenate both period and project name. So now I have the keys added, but what we need to account for as well, we could already link it. Here you can see that the same key is repeating for different lines because for our cost component we have multiple entries for a given period. So if we were to do it, here it would work because we have different items for our costs and just a single entry per combination for our revenue. So that would be a one-to-many relationship. But if I would also have a breakdown of my different income streams, then I would end up with a many-to-many relationship. So let's make our import robust enough that it can also work if I have multiple revenue items. And to do that, we're gonna create an artificial table, a table to link those two tables together based on that key column. So I'm just gonna extract the key column of both tables, and then I'm gonna create a unique list of those key values. We want to generate a unique list of those key values, and we're going to start from those two tables. We want to still retain that table as it is, to work with it in our Power BI report, but we want to get an additional piece out of it. We still want to keep the table as is, but at the same time, I want to have just this single column returned to work with. And to do that, we can make a reference. right click my costs table and select reference. That's gonna create a copy of the table starting from the end position of this query. Rename it to my costs key. From this table, I just want to keep my key column, but I will also include the period and the project name. Select those three columns and then say remove other columns. We're going to do the same for our revenue table. Right click reference, rename it to revenue key, then select our period, project name, and then also the key column, and remove all the other columns. Now I have two tables, one containing my cost keys, one with the revenue keys and the associated labels. The next step is to bring those two tables together. So here we're going to go to append queries as new. I'm going to select my cost key table and my revenue key table. Rename this table to key. Now I want to make sure that I just get a list of unique values. Right click on the column and then say remove duplicates. I end up with a clean table of unique key values, and then I also see the period and the project name. All those columns are text values, so let's change the data type to texts. My costs key and my revenue key table, they were intermediate tables that I used to create my consolidated key table, but I don't need them anymore. They don't need to be part of my final data model. What we can do to allow them to be used within our data load, but not have them part of the final output, is to right click and then here you can untick enable load. And if you have disabled the load, then they become italic. So that means that the query is still there, we can still use it, but it will not be retained in the final data model. Now we are ready to import our data. Let's click close and apply. Our data is loaded. I have my costs, my revenue, and my key table. Now we need to define the relationships. Key table is going to be the glue that is tying my costs and my revenue together. Let's go here from key and then link it to my costs. It's a one-to-many relationship, that's correct. Then I'm also gonna make a link here from my key table to my revenue. Here it's gonna pick my one-to-one relationship because I just have a single entry in my revenue items. I could also say it's a one-to-many if I know at some point there might be a breakdown of different revenue items, then I could go for the one-to-many relationship. Now my data model is complete. Now let's go back to our report canvas. And then I'm just going to remove this chart and start from fresh. And then I'm going to use here my project name. And then I'm also going to add my period on here. And what's important, I'm not picking it from my costs or my revenue table, but from that central table that is tying everything together. Let's change it into a matrix. So I can see for my different projects and here my different periods. Let's bring in our total of the costs and then also our total revenue. Rename it maybe. These are my costs. This is my revenue. Then I can see side by side how it's been evolving over time. Of course, this matrix visual is not a great representation of our data. It was just to validate the data structure. Let's now work on properly displaying our budgeting data. Okay. The first thing that I want to change is that I want to allow the user to select a particular period and see what my data looked like in that particular period, while still having the ability to see the evolution to that particular selected period. Let's start by adding a slicer to select the period. Add a new slicer here, and then I'm going to add the period from my key folder. I have my different periods that are available. I'm going to change the slicer settings and selection. I'm going to say it's a single select. I just want to have one period that is selected. Let's say it's 2024 Q3. And then what you will see, this matrix visual immediately gets filtered based on my selection of the period. Which is okay to some extent, because for a particular project I want to show what is the state of that project at the selected period, but I also want to show the evolution. And before we jump into the creation of the different measures to make it happen, I'm going to add a second slicer to also select my project. Let's add a new slicer here, and I'm going to select my project name. And then I'm going to start to recreating that structure a little bit that I have in my initial budget sheet, just as a starting basis. As a reminder, I have my costs here, a breakdown of the costs, and then a total, and then I had my revenue and the margin. Let's remove this matrix and put the slicers to the left. And then I'm gonna start working on my costs table. Let's go here and add a table. I have my costs here. I have my costs item. So I have my different components. And then I have my 3 different columns in there. One was my actuals to date, my budget to completion, and then I had my total. Rename the columns. The values are fine as they are. I'm not creating new measures because I'm just summing up those items, so that's okay. So those are our cost items. What I will also do is make sure that I will disable the auto size of the width of the column so that I have control of my column structure. I can define a little bit how wide those columns need to be. Let's maybe add a title to it as well. Let's go for title, and then we have costs. And then as the style preset, I'm going to go for my minimum style. Now I have my costs. I'm going to create a similar table for my revenue. So rather than costs, this one is going to be revenue. And then I need to change all my different items here. So it was my revenue item instead of my cost item. And then here as well I have my actuals, budget to completion, and my totals. Rename the columns. So now I have my costs, my revenue. Then I also want to create a table containing my margins. That is something that I cannot immediately get from my tables here and the columns that are available. So I need to create a measure to calculate the margin. I'm going to add them here to this one. Let's say new measure. I have my margin column, which is going to be the sum of the total of my revenue minus the sum of the total of my costs. And then I also want to add the margin percentage, add a second measure, margin percentage, which is going to be our margin measure we already created, divided by the sum of the total revenue. And then instead of a table here, I'm going to add a simple multi-row card to show those 2 KPIs. So I have my margin and my margin percentage. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Now I have my basic structure. I have my breakdown of the costs, revenue, and some key KPIs. I can look at it over the different periods and I can see how it's updating. Then I also want to be able to see the history until the point that I have selected. A challenge that I have with my current data model is that when I select a period here, that it would filter all the periods in my key table. So if I want to show values over time, so let's say for example I have my total cost, let's say I put it here in a line chart, and I want to show it over different periods, then I will always just get one period. So I cannot show the evolution over time, and that is exactly the thing that I want to do. To overcome this, what I can do is to create a disconnected period table that is just going to allow me to have all the values of the different periods and make a selection on it and then work with that selection rather than actually filtering my whole data model. And to create that disconnected table, I'm going to go back to transform data. When it comes to creating that disconnected table, you have 2 options. You could either use Power Query, which is the option that I'm going to take, or you could also use a DAX statement to say, give me the distinct values of periods. That would work as well. And it's quite a small data model, so it would not really make a big difference which one you would pick. But for most use cases, just doing it in Power Query is a little bit more of a best practice. And to get that table of distinct period values, I'm going to start from my key table. And then I'm gonna do a reference of that key table. I'm just gonna keep my period column, so select that column, right click, remove other columns, and everything except the period column is removed from that table. And then I'm gonna right click it again, and I'm gonna say remove duplicates, and then I get a list of distinct period values. I'll rename my table to period, and then between brackets I'll say it's a disconnected, close and apply. If you now check our data model, then you can see we have a period table which is not connected to the main tables of our data model. Here in my slicer, rather than taking the period from the key table, I'm gonna take it from my period table. Move the second option. Now I can slice through the different periods, but of course it's not having any effect on our other visuals. So we need to rework our measures to work with the selection here in my period slicer. So we need to rework our visuals a little bit. Here in our costs table, we have just added the columns directly from the data model. And then we used the sum functionality within the visual, but here instead we're going to use an actual measure so that we are able to filter down based on our slicer here. Let's go to our costs and then create a new measure. I created a new measure named costs actuals. I'm going to do a calculate of the sum of my actuals for my costs, and I'm going to filter my costs table where the period is equal to the selected value of my disconnected period table. Now let's replace the actuals with my measure, move that one, and then you can see now I get the correct values again. So I'm going to do the same for my budget and also for my total. Let's rename my columns. So now my costs table is reworked, and if I then change my period, then I can see that my costs are correctly reflected. Now we're going to do the same for the revenue part. Also here I'm going to create a measure for my actuals, budget to completion, and my total. We have reworked our revenue. Now it's also time to fix our margins. And then with my margin, it's actually, I don't need to have the sum functions anymore. I can just go for total revenue minus my total costs. So the measures that we just created. And then I also have my margin percentage divided by my total revenue. Now it looks like we have done a lot of effort just to end up with where we started right before we started working on that disconnected table. But what we can do now is, if we take here, for example, the total costs, take the total costs, and then also use the period here and bring it in, then I can see the evolution of my total cost over the different periods. Now I can see a little bit my total cost of that project, my forecasted total cost, how has that changed over time. So I can see changes in assumptions. And some small tweak that I also want to make, because here that's correct, so I can see the 3 periods. If I would then go to a prior period, I just want to show it what were my assumptions until that point where we actually made that budget. So if I select Q2, then I just want to show the first 2 values. And to do that, we're going to create a new measure. I named this one cost to date total, and it's actually more or less the same than our costs total. So if you look here, that's almost exactly the same. With a small distinction, here we're going to say equal to the selected value, and then here we're going to say where my period is less than or equal to my selected value. So those measures, they are quite identical, and if I then change the period, then I can say up until the period where I have made that particular budget, then I can see that history. So now we can show both values for a particular period, and we can also show the history up until that period. And this concludes our tutorial on automating your budgets. It was quite a simplistic example, but you learned a lot of very good techniques to automate this process. So you've learned how to set up a proper structure in SharePoint, how to use naming conventions, so to make sure that, for example, we can import project names, that we can import a specific period and use it as a data point within our Power BI model. And then you also learned how to use a disconnected table to slice and dice over the different periods and show the values of that particular period, but also show the history of your assumption so that you can see how has a project evolved over time. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.